All right, here's a quick once over with the bracket notation. Another way of thinking about this is what I call two engines. Whenever you're working on something on a computer, there is some engine um, which is making the thing you're working on work, which is displaying it to you. Treating it broadly, you could think of anything that you could read or edit or change or reference on a computer as a text. The wiki insight, the things that drives all wikis, is that you can embed codes in a text that are not part of the structure or meaning of the text, but that are meaningful to a parser. The parser is the second engine. The second engine reads the text, finds the codes, and responds to them. I call it the bracket engine. Quite likely, the bracket engine's only responsibility is to find the codes and then hand them off to some application it thinks can respond to them. In our case, it probably would hand them off to a Docker swarm. Okay, as an example, here's a piece of text I wrote on the Power BI forum. And it has a link in it to another post about using blobs as keys in MySQL. All right. One issue in forums is that common problems reoccur all the time. So maybe I'm trying to build up a list, a curated list of problems. And I want to add this problem to my list. So in order to do that, I use a bracket. I put the bracket, and in the bracket, I put a description, and then I add some information. The bracket has an opening bracket, a closing bracket, and a bar, which separates the descriptive part from the information. So, generally speaking, what comes before the bar is a function, and what comes after the bar is the argument, the information that's passed to the function. Okay, let's say, for sake of example, my bracket engine runs as a service, and I have configured it to monitor all the posts I write on this forum. So when it reads this post, it finds the brackets, and the first thing it looks for is the function that it should execute, which is Power BI arrow data types arrow MySQL. Now, this is an example of a function which has a shortcut. The function itself probably would be named something like hierarchy, but in this case, the presence of the arrows identifies the function. And is a way of cheating and passing it information about just where in the hierarchy I would like the information I'm sending to be stored. So the these two pieces of information get handed off to some application which can take some action. And let's say there's a set of Docker elements which finds the database where I'm storing this hierarchy, checks to see if these three levels exist. If they don't exist, creates them, and then stores the information, the link, at the MySQL level of the hierarchy. Okay, so the question is, how does the bracket engine know what functions can be executed by, say, the Docker swarm that it's using to do its execution? Probably it doesn't know. it probably should just hand off everything. And if the Docker swarm cannot find a function, its response should be to say something like no function available, or potentially a list of suggestions about where a function could be found and added to its repertoire. Um, or perhaps looking for the function under a different name. There may be several functions which are aliased or are syntactical sugar for each other. What the bracket engine gets back after it's handed off the information it found while parsing is a return value. And that return value replaces the brackets in the text. In this case, it would be a hyperlink that would link to the application that was a front end for the database where I'm storing my hierarchies so that I could go browse my hierarchy. Anytime the bracket engine finds brackets and passes them off, it also would pass off their context, that is, the document that they were found in. And potentially could have a setting where instead of just storing the argument that's sent in the brackets, it would also store the entire document. Okay, now it starts getting interesting. Other people see me using the brackets and find out what they are and say they would like to do it too, or they would like to have access to my hierarchy. So depending on the implementations, we could do it in different ways. They could run their own bracket engine, or potentially we move the bracket engine to the cloud, let them register, and then I create the hierarchy as a shared hierarchy that has a set of members, all of whom can post to it. If I did that, when I open up the hierarchy interface, I would see nodes in the hierarchy that had been created by many users. And I might find that some users are idiots in terms of how they create nodes, or create nodes in a way that I don't find useful. So just like on Twitter, I would mute them so that after that, their nodes would be in the hierarchy, but I would not see them when I was browsing the hierarchy. The same thing might occur for some topics that get placed in the hierarchy, because there's nothing to say that the hierarchy would be unified. It actually would be an overlay of lots of small hierarchies created by the different users, and some of them may go off in directions that I'm just not interested in. So I could mute topics and hide whole trees from my view when I'm navigating the hierarchy. Now we've talked about sending information, the bracket in sending information to, say, a Docker swarm to take some action, but there's nothing that says that that Docker swarm could only act on instructions from the bracket engine. For example, if I wanted to have some way of remembering interesting information I found on web pages, I could write a little JavaScript bookmarklet that would basically send a request that contained the same information that would be in the bracket to the same Docker swarm that was managing my hierarchy. And that Docker swarm would insert that request into the hierarchy. And instead of having a pointer back to some document where I had put brackets, it would have a pointer back to the entire web page. The bracket notation is extremely flexible, and I can use it basically anywhere I can type something in on my keyboard. So the difference here between using the bracket notation and using an application like Roam is that the bracket notation is not enclosed in an application. The brackets, in some ways, are more like viruses. They contain very small bits of information, but they're capable of triggering the bracket engine to do things, just like a virus inserts itself into a cell and triggers it to do things. Um, if we look at Roam, which is a fantastic application, a little bit more, it uses a wiki-like notation, and it uses square brackets. It parses the square brackets and does all kinds of great things that allow you to organize and cross-reference your information. If Roam had an API, I'm not certain whether it does or not, then a bracket engine could send information to Roam instead of sending it to a Docker swarm and have Roam store it. It's important to think that the bracket engine basically has a big list of, of functions and doesn't care what the functions are. So that when it gets a function name from a bracket, it just looks up that function and passes it the argument. It's totally neutral about whether it's sending it to a Docker swarm, writing it to a Roam application, writing it into a spreadsheet. In fact, it could be able to do all those things. That is not everything, but it's the end of the short explanation. Hope it helped.